You know, sometimes as therapists, we overanalyze things that don't need to be overanalyzed. And this happens a lot more frequently than it should. And sometimes we don't want to admit when we're just trying to pump ourselves up and make us feel like we found something deep that someone is struggling with. People don't want to admit this, but this is a real problem in psychotherapy is that the therapist has an ego too. They're a person too. And so sometimes that therapist ego gets in the way of the therapy itself. And I think this needs to be explored more in therapy and in the way that we train people. But one of the ways I see this play out most is when we tell people that they're just distracting themselves from their pain. And look, sometimes this is true, and you have to work with your own therapist to figure out if this is true. But sometimes what we call distraction is actually just a person living their life. Whatever it is that they enjoy doing, maybe it's watching TV, maybe it's video games here and there, maybe it's going out and traveling, maybe it's going out and playing basketball. Whatever activity you like to do, it's so easy for a therapist to say, hey, you're just distracting yourself from your pain. You're not really letting yourself feel that pain through and process your emotions, which is another hot word that therapists like to use that really doesn't have a lot of meaning and it's very ambiguous and not very well explained. Processing your emotions. What exactly does that mean? I still don't know, to be honest with you. And so we tell clients, don't distract yourself, process your emotions, work through your emotions without really giving them a whole lot of guidance. And sometimes it's not even necessary. And sometimes it's the very act of going through those emotions that actually causes the pain itself. Because the reality is that life is painful. Find me a person on this planet who hasn't experienced a painful event in their life, right? If you have a death of someone who you're close with, that's a painful experience. And at what point is it okay to move on from that pain and go live your life? If you're grieving and you start to engage in some life activities after a few months, is that distracting or are you just going out and living your life? How do you exactly define that? And sometimes by focusing too much on that pain, that actually is rumination, right? There's not much of a difference between self reflection and rumination. There is time for self reflection, but sometimes self reflection is just rumination and it is just unnecessary pain. And the idle mind left to its own devices can go to pretty dark places. And sometimes that's a good thing. Again, sometimes we are avoiding things and it's showing up in other ways in our life that maybe we weren't so aware of, right? It's damaging our relationships because we're so tuned out from our relationships that we can't connect with anyone. Or because we're in so much pain, we're acting out in our relationships and we don't want to admit it or acknowledge it. In those cases, yes, of course, we need to figure out what's going on there. But a lot of times there's just a point where it's time to move on in life. And if you've gone through something difficult and you're starting to make some progress and starting to heal, and then you start engaging back into some of your old activities, be careful not to tell yourself, oh, I'm just distracting myself. I haven't really dealt with my problems, because that's what life is. Life is constantly overcoming difficult things and then readjusting and going back to living again, because you cannot just dwell on the past forever. And sometimes, whether it's because of therapy or just because of our own self reflection, we get so caught up in wanting to make sure that we're okay, that we're right to move on, we're in a good place to move on. And we overthink things. So, how do we figure this out? How do we figure out, okay, when is it right for me to actually just start living my life again after a painful part in my life? Maybe a loss, maybe it's some trauma in your life that you're trying to recover from. How do you figure that out? Now, again, you have to go through this with your actual therapist. They know your story. I don't, right? But the first question to ask yourself is, well, am I actually in pain? When I sit with myself, what comes up? Are there negative emotions that are constantly flooding my system that I'm simply just escaping from? and I'm going into video games, or even worse, drugs and alcohol, or I'm going out and I'm traveling here and there, or I'm having promiscuous relationships with this person and that person and just bopping around. If you're doing that, then okay, then you're in pain, and your behavior is coming from a place of trying to suppress that pain. You're trying to ignore or avoid that pain. And so, yes, you're distracting yourself, right? But if you look inward and you say, yeah, obviously there's some pain, some normal pain there because I went through something difficult, but my behavior is not any different than my normal behavior. Like I'm just going back to living my life again. There's your first key, that maybe you're not distracting yourself. Maybe you're just back to living. And the second thing you need to do, and this is tied into this one, is your behavior destructive? Are the things that you're doing, and maybe you're not even fully aware, you might have to check in with people in your life, or maybe people in your life are telling you, hey, you've changed. Things are happening. You're acting in a way that is not typical for you. If you're acting in a way that's not typical for you, if it's disrupting your relationships, disrupting your work, your sleep, your eating habits, your main functioning of life, then yes, that's a problem, right? And at that point, you can maybe say, okay, I'm just trying to distract myself because I don't really want to deal with the pain that I'm suffering. So, of course, there are situations where that is the case. But I think we also have to realize that sometimes it's just time to move on. And you're never going to fully heal from a very painful event, okay? Life throws things at us that are impossible to heal from, okay? You lose someone very close to you at a very young age, you're never going to forget that person. Okay. There always will be a part of you. I'm just giving an example of one thing. There's tons of different ways that life can hurt us, obviously. And sometimes I think in therapy, maybe our expectations are too high. I don't mean to say that the things we want to heal from can't be healed from. We can heal. But to think that we're never going to have an issue again, or we're never going to get triggered by something, or we're never going to have a bad day, that's not going to happen. You take whatever you're struggling with and you move through life. You don't let it prevent you from living, because that is the definition of a disorder. If you look at the DSM, any diagnosis, whether it's depression, anxiety, PTSD, you name it, the defining factor in all of those disorders is that it has to have a significant impact on your day-to-day life. Okay? So the symptoms alone can't get you there. Okay. Now, usually if you have really severe symptoms, right? If you have very severe symptoms of anxiety, depression, PTSD, yeah, it's going to be pretty hard for you to live a functioning life. Okay. But that doesn't mean that you can't have some symptoms and live a functioning life. And if you're living a functioning life, that's good. That's a good thing. You don't have to just keep dredging up the past just because you're not fully healed. You'll never be fully healed. There's no fully healed person because life isn't perfect. Everybody has some pain that they're holding on to. And it's just something you move through. It gets easier, it gets better, but it doesn't always fully go away. And in some cases, maybe you don't even want it to fully go away, right? I mean, if it's a loss, if it's a major loss, do you want to forget that person? No. Sometimes maybe you want to be reminded of the sadness of missing that person. I think sometimes in psychology, we over pathologize things that are just normal human suffering. And suffering is inevitable. It's not good, but we make it worse by trying to perfect it and make it go away, because that's when we obsess and that's when we ruminate. So I realize this is going to look different for everybody. And obviously, again, you have to work with your therapist. They know you best. You know your situation the best. Okay. But just keep in mind that just because you're going about your life, doing things, enjoying your life, doesn't mean that you're distracting yourself from some deep, dark pain down there. Okay. It doesn't always mean that. It means that you're moving on, and that's a good thing. But of course, again, if there is still pain there when you look inward, or there are destructive behaviors that you're noticing, then yes, that is a problem and that needs to be resolved so that you can actually go live a life that isn't just distraction, that you're actually engaged in your life. And maybe that's another thing to look at. How engaged are you in these activities when you're doing them? Are you just floating by? Are you not really present when you're engaging? If that's the case, then yeah, then maybe you're just distracting. But if you're going into these events and you're enjoying them and you're having a good time, and then you come back and maybe you get a memory of something that makes you a little sad, that's just called living life. And that's okay. I hope this resonated with some of you. Thanks again for listening in, and I'll see you soon.